Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Mountain View, Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The silence that descended upon the Blackwood family homestead on that autumn evening of 1871 wasn't just the ordinary quiet that often settles over the Ozark Mountains as daylight fades. This was a silence that had weight to it, a silence that seemed to swallow every creak of the wooden floorboards, every whisper of wind through the oak trees surrounding the property, a silence that would echo through the small community of Mountain View for decades to come. Mountain View in 1871 was barely established, a fledgling settlement nestled in what would later become Stone County. The area was rugged then, isolated from the rest of Arkansas by the dense forests and rolling hills of the Ozarks. Families who settled there relied on self-sufficiency and neighborly bonds to survive the harsh winters and unpredictable harvests. Most lived in simple log structures or modest frame houses built from lumber cut from the surrounding forests. The Blackwood home stood apart, however, a two-story dog-trot house with a wide central hallway that caught the summer breezes. It was considered one of the finer homes in the area, a testament to Thomas Blackwood's success as both a farmer and trader. According to records from the Stone County Historical Society, Thomas Blackwood arrived in the Ozarks from Tennessee in the spring of 1868 with his wife Margaret and his brother James. The brothers purchased adjoining parcels of land along what is now the White River and set about establishing themselves as prosperous members of the growing community. Both men were said to be hardworking and ambitious, with Thomas quickly gaining a reputation as a shrewd businessman. Within 3 years, the Blackwood brothers had expanded their holdings to include nearly 200 acres of prime farmland and a small but profitable general store that served travelers and locals alike. The brothers had always been close, sharing in both business ventures and family celebrations. Thomas's wife Margaret was known throughout the community for her hospitality and her exceptional cooking skills. Their Sunday dinners became something of a local institution, with the extended family gathering each week to enjoy Margaret's famous roast beef and blackberry cobbler. James, who had remained a bachelor, was a fixture at these gatherings, often entertaining the company with tales from his frequent travels to Little Rock and beyond. But on the evening of October 23, 1871, the usual warmth of the Blackwood family dinner would be replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settling over the mountains. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just what happened that night, but the events leading up to it, a slow unraveling of bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. The documents preserved from that time tell a story of growing tensions between the brothers, though the exact nature of their disagreement remains a matter of speculation. Some accounts suggest it was a dispute over property boundaries, while others hint at more personal betrayals. Margaret Blackwood's diary, discovered decades later during renovations to the old homestead, provides perhaps the most insight into the deteriorating relationship between Thomas and James. Her entries from the summer of 1871 describe a growing coldness between the brothers, with James becoming increasingly withdrawn and Thomas displaying uncharacteristic bursts of temper. An entry dated August 17, 1871 reads, "Thomas returned from the store in a black mood today. He would not speak of what troubled him, but I saw the way his eyes followed James when he came to borrow the plow. There is something unspoken between them, something that casts a shadow over our home." By early October, the strain had become obvious to everyone in the small community. Ezekiel Parsons, whose farm bordered the Blackwood property, later testified to the county sheriff that he had witnessed a heated exchange between the brothers at the general store just days before the fateful dinner. According to Parsons, they were arguing over some papers, speaking in low voices that grew louder as their anger rose. James said something about "what's rightfully mine," And Thomas replied that blood only runs so deep. I've never seen such coldness between two brothers who once seemed inseparable. Margaret's diary entries became increasingly anxious as October progressed. On October 20th, she wrote, "I fear what may come of this bitterness between them. Thomas sleeps poorly, pacing the floors at night. When I ask him to confide in me, he says only that James has changed and that I should be cautious around him. I have known James as a brother for these past years, and while he has grown more solitary of late, I cannot imagine what Thomas fears." The small settlement of Mountain View in 1871 was hardly more than a cluster of homesteads scattered among the thick forests and rolling hills of the Ozarks. Life there was defined by the rhythms of agriculture and the isolation of mountain living. The nearest town of significant size was a 2-day journey by horseback, which meant that residents relied heavily on one another for both practical assistance and social connection. This isolation fostered a tight-knit community where everyone knew their neighbor's business, yet paradoxically, it also allowed for secrets to be buried deep beneath the veneer of rural propriety. The Blackwood brothers had quickly established themselves as pillars of this frontier community. Their general store became not just a place of commerce, but a social hub where locals gathered to exchange news and gossip. Thomas was known for extending credit to farmers who had suffered poor harvests, while James organized the community's first lending library. A modest collection housed in a corner of the store comprised mostly of books he had brought from Tennessee or acquired during his travels. Margaret Blackwood was equally respected in the community. Beyond her renowned cooking skills, she had established the settlement's first informal school, teaching basic reading and arithmetic to the neighbors' children several afternoons each week. A woman of considerable education for her time, Margaret had been a schoolteacher in Tennessee before her marriage, and she brought that passion for learning to her new home in the Ozarks. This reputation for generosity and community involvement made the growing tension between the brothers all the more noticeable and concerning to their neighbors. Sophia Daniels, the wife of the local blacksmith, later recalled that the atmosphere at church services had changed palpably by early October. The Blackwood brothers had always sat together in the same pew with Margaret between them, she noted in an account recorded in 1925. But on the Sunday before that dinner, Thomas sat at one end of the church and James at the other. Neither would look at the other, and poor Margaret seemed lost, sitting alone in their usual pew with that empty space beside her, like an accusation. The Blackwood home itself was a source of pride for the community. Unlike the typical log cabins that dominated the landscape, their house represented aspiration and success. Built in the dog-trot style common to the region, but elevated by finer details, the 2-story structure featured glass windows imported at considerable expense from St. Louis, wide plank floors of polished oak, and a stone fireplace that dominated the main sitting room. The dining room, where the fateful meal would take place, was particularly impressive by frontier standards. A handcrafted table of solid walnut could seat 12 comfortably, though typically it was just the 3 of them, Thomas, Margaret, and James, who gathered there each evening. The walls were adorned with Margaret's careful needlework, scenes of pastoral beauty that contrasted sharply with the rugged reality outside their windows. A china cabinet displayed Margaret's prized possession, a set of blue and white porcelain dishes inherited from her grandmother, used only for special occasions or Sunday dinners. It was these special dishes that Margaret chose to set the table with on October 23, 1871, perhaps hoping that the formality would encourage civility between the increasingly hostile brothers. Her diary entry from that morning reveals both her anxiety and her determination. "I have set the table with grandmother's china, though Thomas questioned my choice. It's not Sunday," he said, as if that were reason enough to avoid making an effort. "I told him that mending what is broken between him and James is occasion enough for the good dishes. He did not reply, only looked at me with such weariness that my heart ached for him. Whatever lies between them It weighs on him like a physical burden. The day itself was described in several accounts as unseasonably warm for late October, with a strange, heavy quality to the air that presaged the coming winter but held it temporarily at bay. The trees surrounding the Blackwood property blazed with autumn colors, deep crimsons, fierce oranges, burnished golds, creating a fiery backdrop to the building human drama. Several neighbors reported seeing James Blackwood riding toward his brother's home that evening, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun, moving with a deliberate slowness that seemed somehow portentous. Inside the Blackwood home, Margaret had spent the day preparing an elaborate meal, perhaps hoping that the shared pleasure of good food might soften the hardened hearts of the brothers. Her diary details her efforts: venison roasted with herbs from her kitchen garden, fresh baked bread still warm from the oven, vegetables preserved from the summer's harvest, and that special sorghum molasses cake that James had always particularly enjoyed. The table was set with care, the blue and white china gleaming in the light of beeswax candles, polished silver cutlery laid with precision at each place setting, crystal glasses that caught and fractured the golden candlelight. It was a scene of domestic perfection, a testament to the civilization that the Blackwoods had managed to create in this wild corner of Arkansas. What a contrast this setting would provide to the terrible silence that was to come. As the hour of dinner approached, Thomas retreated to his study, a small room off the main sitting area where he kept the account books for the store and the farm. Margaret's diary notes that he remained there unusually long, emerging only when she called him to the table after James's arrival. He had been drinking, she wrote, not heavily, but enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath when he kissed my cheek. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out my chair, and when James entered the room, I saw him straighten his shoulders as if bracing for a physical blow. James arrived precisely at 5 o'clock, as was his custom. Margaret described him as unusually formal, dressed in his best suit as if for church or a business meeting in town. He brought with him a bottle of fine Kentucky bourbon, a peace offering perhaps, or as Margaret later came to believe, liquid courage for what he knew would be a confrontation. The early portion of the meal proceeded with excruciating politeness. Margaret recorded that the conversation remained stubbornly fixed on neutral topics: the weather, the condition of the roads, news from the general store. Both brothers ate little, but drank steadily from the bourbon James had brought. The tension in the room grew with each passing minute, a pressure building like the approach of a storm. It was as the main course was being cleared away that the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Margaret wrote that James suddenly placed his fork down with deliberate care and reached into his coat pocket. "I have something to show you, brother," he said, producing a folded document that he placed on the table between them. The nature of this document remains one of the central mysteries of the Blackwood case. Whatever it contained was enough to drain the color from Thomas's face and elicit that chilling exchange. "I know what you've done," from Thomas, followed by James's unsettling reply, "And now you know why it had to be this way." The silence that followed these words was described by Margaret as unlike any I have known. She wrote that it seemed as if all the air had been drawn from the room, leaving them suspended in a vacuum of unspoken horror. Thomas and James stared at each other across the table, opponents in some terrible game whose rules Margaret did not understand. "I realized in that moment," she continued, "that I was in the presence of something terrible. Not a quarrel between brothers, but a revelation of some truth so dark that it could never be spoken aloud." What exactly was contained in that document? What terrible truth had been revealed? Margaret never explicitly states it, and subsequent investigations would fail to uncover the paper in question. But whatever it was, altered the course of all their lives irrevocably. The remainder of that evening passed in that unnatural silence. Neither brother spoke another word. Eventually, James stood, nodded formally to Margaret, and left. Thomas remained at the table long after the candles had burned low, staring at nothing, a half-empty glass of whiskey clutched in his hand. Margaret's final entry for that night reads simply, "I fear what tomorrow may bring. There is a stillness in Thomas that frightens me more than any rage." Her fears proved well-founded, for the next morning Thomas Blackwood was gone. He had left before dawn, taking only his horse, his rifle, and a small traveling bag. He left no note, no explanation for his sudden departure. James Blackwood was found later that same day in his cabin across the property. According to the sparse official report filed by the county sheriff, he was seated at his desk, a pen still in his hand, as if he had been writing a letter. His body was cold, his heart stilled, by what the local doctor could only describe as a sudden seizure of the heart brought on by extreme agitation. No foul play was suspected at the time. The doctor noted that James had occasionally complained of chest pains in recent months, and a heart condition was a plausible explanation for his death. But the timing, coming so soon after that silent, tension-filled dinner, raised questions that would never be satisfactorily answered. Margaret Blackwood remained in the family home for several more weeks, apparently waiting for her husband's return. But as autumn deepened into winter with no word from Thomas, she finally accepted what many in the community already believed, that Thomas Blackwood had no intention of returning to Mountain View. In December of 1871, Margaret sold the property and moved to Little Rock to live with a cousin. She took little with her from the life she had built with Thomas, but she did preserve her diary, which would later provide the only first-hand account of the events surrounding that October evening. The Blackwood property changed hands several times over the subsequent decades. Those who lived there often reported a peculiar heaviness in the dining room, a lingering sense of unresolved tension. Some claimed to hear the soft clink of silverware against china when the room was empty, or to feel a sudden drop in temperature when passing through the central hall where Thomas had last been seen. For nearly a century, the mystery of what had transpired between the Blackwood brothers remained buried, a curious footnote in the early history of Mountain View. But in 1964, during renovations to the original structure, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had been James Blackwood's bedroom. The compartment contained a metal strongbox, surprisingly well preserved despite the passage of time. Inside was a collection of documents, land deeds, financial records, and personal correspondence. Among these papers was a partially burned letter, dated October 22, 1871, the day before the infamous silent dinner. The letter was addressed to Thomas Blackwood, though it appears it was never delivered. Written in James's distinctive hand, it contained a confession of sorts, though the fire that had consumed nearly half the page left the nature of this confession tantalizingly unclear. The surviving fragments speak of unbearable guilt and a deception that cannot be sustained. James wrote of a secret that lies between us like a sword, and of his intention to make right what can never truly be made whole again. The letter concludes with a passage that has been the subject of much speculation among local historians. By the time you read these words, brother, you will know the truth of what happened that night in Nashville. You will know that the man you have called brother all these years is not the man you believed him to be. Some sins cannot be washed away, not even by blood. What happened in Nashville? What sin could have been so terrible that it drove one brother to flee his home and may have contributed to the death of the other? The historical record remains frustratingly silent on these questions. No mention of any incident involving either Thomas or James Blackwood can be found in Nashville newspapers or court records from the years preceding their arrival in Arkansas. Some local scholars have suggested that the brothers may have been involved in some criminal activity during the chaotic years following the Civil War, when lawlessness was common in many parts of Tennessee. Others propose that the reference to Nashville might concern a woman, perhaps a love triangle that ended in tragedy or betrayal. Still others believe that the blood reference might suggest that James and Thomas were not actually brothers at all, but that one or both had assumed false identities for reasons lost to history. What we do know with certainty is that Thomas Blackwood was never seen again in Mountain View, or, indeed, anywhere in Arkansas. Margaret's cousin in Little Rock later reported that she received a single letter from Thomas in 1873, postmarked from San Francisco, containing only a brief apology and the statement that some distances cannot be bridged and some silences must remain unbroken. Margaret herself never remarried. She died in 1902 at the age of 73, taking whatever additional knowledge she may have had about the events of that October evening to her grave. The Blackwood property still stands today, though it has been extensively renovated over the years. The current owners operate it as a bed and breakfast, capitalizing on its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the Ozarks. Guests often report unusual occurrences: doors that open and close on their own, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, and most commonly the sensation of being watched while dining in what was once the Blackwood family dining room. But perhaps the most unsettling reports come from those who have spent the night in the main bedroom, what would have been Thomas and Margaret's room. Several guests have awakened in the early hours before dawn to find a man standing at the foot of the bed, his face obscured in shadow. He never speaks, never approaches, but simply watches in silence before fading into the darkness. Is this the restless spirit of Thomas Blackwood, forever bound to the home he fled in such mysterious circumstances? Or is it James, seeking some form of absolution for whatever sin he confessed in that partially burned letter? The community's reaction to the events of October 1871 provides another layer to this unfolding mystery. According to local newspaper accounts from the time, James Blackwood's funeral was a modest affair, attended by only a handful of neighbors despite his previous standing in the community. This curious absence of mourners suggests that perhaps there were rumors circulating, whispers about the nature of his death or the reason for Thomas's sudden disappearance. The local preacher, Reverend Elijah Harper, made a cryptic note in the church registry regarding the service. "Buried James Blackwood today. The Lord knows all secrets, even those we keep from ourselves. May he find the peace in death that eluded him in life." This unusually personal comment from a man known for his formal and reserved manner in official documents hints at some knowledge of the troubles that had plagued the Blackwood brothers. In the weeks following James's death and Thomas's disappearance, the community of Mountain View seemed to close ranks around Margaret. Neighbors brought food, offered assistance with the farm, and generally tried to shield her from the worst of the gossip. But behind this veneer of support, there was a palpable undercurrent of fear, a collective unease about what might have transpired between the brothers and whether it posed some threat to the wider community. Several families who had been regular customers at the Blackwood General Store took their business elsewhere, traveling considerable distances to avoid the now tainted establishment. The store itself fell into rapid decline without Thomas's management, and by December, when Margaret decided to leave Mountain View, it had already closed its doors. The property, both the house and the store, sold for considerably less than its value, a testament to the shadow that now hung over it. The buyer, a man named Horace Simmons, who had recently arrived from Missouri, was apparently unaware of the property's history. He lasted less than a year before selling the house and land at an even greater loss and returning to Missouri, claiming that he could not abide the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Between 1872 and 1890, the Blackwood property changed hands no fewer than 7 times, with no owner staying longer than 3 years. Local legend holds that each owner experienced some form of misfortune, financial ruin, illness, family discord, or in one particularly tragic case, the death of a spouse under mysterious circumstances. While many of these tales are likely embellishments added over time, county records do confirm the unusual turnover in ownership, suggesting that there was something about the property that repelled those who tried to make it their home. In 1891, a widow named Elizabeth Crenshaw purchased the property for a fraction of its original value. Unlike previous owners, she seemed immune to whatever malign influence haunted the place. She lived there in apparent contentment for over 30 years, eventually dying peacefully in her sleep in 1924 at the age of 87. During her tenure, the legends about the Blackwood mystery began to fade from local memory, relegated to occasional tales told around winter fires. It was only with the discovery of the strong box in 1964 that interest in the case was rekindled. The partial letter found inside, with its tantalizing references to Nashville and some unspecified sin, captured the imagination of local historians and amateur sleuths. The story of the silent dinner and its aftermath began to circulate once more, gaining new details and embellishments with each retelling. In 1968, a graduate student from the University of Arkansas conducted a series of interviews with elderly residents of Mountain View as part of a folklore project. One interviewee, Martha Collins, then 92 years old, shared a story passed down from her mother, who had been a young woman at the time of the Blackwood incident. According to Collins, there had been rumors in the community about James Blackwood in the weeks before his death. He had reportedly been seen several times at night, digging near the edge of his property where it bordered the river. When asked about these activities by neighbors, he claimed to be merely improving drainage ahead of the winter rains. But Collins's mother had never believed this explanation. Mama said there was something wrong about the way James had been acting, Collins recounted. Said he'd gotten jumpy, always looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be there. And she said the most peculiar thing was that James, who'd always been known for whistling as he worked, had gone completely silent. Wouldn't say more than a word or two to folks he'd known for years. This observation, while seemingly minor, adds another layer to our understanding of the growing tension between the brothers. James's uncharacteristic silence in the weeks leading up to the fateful dinner suggests a man weighed down by some terrible knowledge or decision, a man perhaps preparing himself for a confrontation he knew would change everything. But what of Thomas Blackwood? What became of the man who fled his home in the pre-dawn darkness, never to return to the community he had helped to build? There are hints scattered through historical records like breadcrumbs, but they lead to no satisfying conclusion. A man matching Thomas's description appears in the registry of a hotel in Memphis in November 1871, just weeks after his disappearance from Mountain View. In January 1872, a T. Blackwood is listed among the passengers on a steamer bound for New Orleans. And as mentioned earlier, Margaret received that single letter from San Francisco in 1873. After that, the trail goes cold. No death certificate has ever been found. No record of remarriage or property ownership that can be definitively linked to Thomas Blackwood. It's as if he simply vanished into the vast expanses of the American West, shedding his identity like a snake discards its skin. This disappearance has led some to speculate that Thomas Blackwood may not have been his real name at all, that perhaps both brothers had been living under assumed identities for reasons unknown. The burned letter found in James's strongbox, with its cryptic reference to the man you have called brother, certainly suggests some level of deception existed between them. The last verified sighting of Thomas comes from a rather unexpected source, a journal kept by a Jesuit missionary working among Native American communities in Washington Territory, now Washington State. In an entry dated July 1876, the missionary describes encountering a solitary American, a man of perhaps 40 years, who gave his name only as Thomas. The description of this man, tall, with a distinctive scar above his right eye, matches what we know of Thomas Blackwood. The missionary wrote that this Thomas seemed haunted by some private sorrow, and spoke little of his past, saying only that he had come west to outrun a truth that would not stay buried. The man stayed at the mission for just 3 days before continuing northward, reportedly intending to cross into British Columbia. Was this truly Thomas Blackwood? And if so, what truth was he trying to outrun? We can only speculate weaving possibilities from the scant threads of evidence that have survived. One theory that has gained some traction among local historians focuses on the brothers' origins in Tennessee. Records indicate that both men arrived in Arkansas shortly after the Civil War, a time when many Southerners were relocating to rebuild their lives. But detailed investigation into Tennessee archives has failed to locate any record of a Thomas or James Blackwood that matches the brothers' approximate ages. This absence of records is particularly interesting given a notation found in an 1867 registry from a Nashville bank. A cashier's log mentions a withdrawal of a substantial sum by a T. Blackwood with a note that the bank manager requested additional verification of identity before releasing the funds. This suggests that even then there may have been some question about Thomas Blackwood's identity. Could the brothers have been involved in some form of financial fraud? Were they perhaps deserters from the Confederate Army, living under assumed names to avoid prosecution? Or was their deception tied to something darker, a crime committed in Tennessee that followed them to their new life in Arkansas? The reference in James's burned letter to what happened that night in Nashville certainly suggests a specific incident, potentially violent in nature, given the mention of blood. But without more concrete evidence, these theories remain just that. Theories, possibilities, suspended in the vacuum created by the brothers' silence. What we are left with, then, is the silence itself, a silence that began at that dinner table in October 1871 and spread outward like ripples in a pond, touching all who came into contact with the Blackwood mystery. Margaret's silence as she waited weeks for a husband who would never return. The silence of the community, who surely must have speculated endlessly about what had transpired, but left little written record of their theories. The silence of Thomas as he journeyed westward, carrying his secrets with him. And finally, the silence of history, which has swallowed so many details of this strange case, leaving only tantalizing fragments from which we must construct our understanding. In 1955, a historian named Dr. Eleanor Winters became fascinated with the Blackwood case while researching the early settlement patterns of the Ozarks. She spent several years collecting what information she could find, interviewing descendants of Mountain View residents who might have heard stories passed down through generations. Her most significant discovery came through a descendant of Ezekiel Parsons, the neighbor who had witnessed the brothers arguing at the general store. This descendant possessed a letter written by Parsons to his sister in Missouri, dated November 1871, just weeks after James's death and Thomas's disappearance. In this letter, Parsons mentions a rumor that had begun to circulate through the community, that James Blackwood had been seen in Nashville earlier that year, meeting with a man who had served as a Union officer during the Civil War. Given the still raw wounds of the conflict, such an association would have been scandalous in itself for a Southern man like James. But Parsons goes further, writing, "Some say that James was providing information to this officer about certain individuals who had been involved in guerrilla activities during the war, individuals who had escaped justice and established new lives under different names. If this is true, and if his own brother was among those he betrayed, it would explain much about the tragedy that has befallen them both. Was Thomas Blackwood a former Confederate guerrilla fighter living under an assumed identity to escape prosecution for wartime actions? And had James discovered this truth and betrayed him, perhaps out of a desire for justice, or more prosaically, for financial gain? This theory would explain the reference to Nashville in the burned letter, as well as the cryptic statement about the man you have called brother. It would also provide a motive for Thomas's immediate flight following the revelation. Former guerrillas, especially those implicated in atrocities against civilian populations, faced severe penalties if caught. But as with all theories surrounding the Blackwood case, this one too rests on circumstantial evidence and conjecture. Dr. Winters herself acknowledged in her unpublished manuscript on the case that the silence at the heart of this mystery refuses to be filled with mere speculation. The truth of what passed between the Blackwood brothers, that October evening remains locked in a silence as deep as the grave. Perhaps the most poignant element of the Blackwood mystery is the way it affects those who encounter it. The current owners of the property report that many guests who stay in the house without knowing its history experience vivid dreams of a dinner table scene, a man and woman sitting in tense silence, with a third figure whose face remains in shadow. Some wake with an inexplicable sense of dread, a feeling that they have witnessed something they were not meant to see. Local folklore has expanded upon the historical facts, as folklore inevitably does. Some versions of the story claim that both brothers were in love with Margaret, and that the document James presented at dinner was proof that Thomas had won her hand through deception. Others suggest that the brothers had discovered gold during the war and hidden it, with James's document being a map to its location, a map that Thomas took with him when he fled. These elaborations, while entertaining, distract from the stark simplicity of what we do know, that something was revealed at that dinner table which shattered the bonds between two brothers, led to the death of one and the disappearance of the other, and left behind a silence that has endured for over 150 years. In 1964, the same year the strongbox was discovered beneath the floorboards of James's room, a severe storm hit the Mountain View area, causing flash flooding along the White River. The flooding uncovered something on what had once been the edge of James Blackwood's property, the area where, according to Martha Collins's account, he had been seen digging in the weeks before his death. What emerged from the saturated soil was a small metal container similar to a military ammunition box. Inside, preserved by the sealed environment, was a leather-bound journal. The water damage to the journal made much of it illegible, but certain passages remained clear enough to read. The journal appeared to belong to James Blackwood, though he never explicitly identifies himself as the author. The legible entries begin in June 1871, just months before the fateful dinner. They paint a picture of a man increasingly troubled by his conscience, wrestling with a decision that he describes as both necessary and unforgivable. One entry reads, "I have carried this burden for too long. The faces of those who suffered haunt my dreams." Can justice be served by more deception? And yet, what choice remains when the law itself has failed? Another passage, dated October 15, 1871, states, "I have written to Captain H. in Nashville. The evidence he requires will be provided. May God forgive me for what I am about to do, for I know T. never will." The final readable entry, dated October 22nd, the day before the dinner and the same date as the partially burned letter found in the strongbox, contains perhaps the most revealing passage. "Tomorrow it ends. I will show him what I have discovered." And the truth that has bound us in silent complicity these past years will finally be spoken aloud. If there is to be a reckoning, let it come. Better that than to continue living this lie. These cryptic statements seem to support the theory that James had decided to expose some past wrongdoing, possibly related to the Civil War, in which both brothers were implicated. The reference to Captain H. suggests a military connection, potentially lending credence to the idea that Thomas may have been a former Confederate guerrilla, and James had decided to inform on him. But as with everything in the Blackwood case, these journal entries raise as many questions as they answer. Who were those who suffered that haunted James's dreams? What evidence was he providing to Captain H? And what was the truth that had bound the brothers in silent complicity for years? The storm-revealed journal was donated to the Stone County Historical Society, where it remains today, a tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive piece of the puzzle. The current curator, Dr. Samuel Hendricks, has spent years trying to identify Captain H through military records from the Civil War period, but has yet to find a definitive match. The Blackwood mystery is like a mirror, Dr. Hendricks observed in a 2019 interview with a regional historical journal. People tend to see in it a reflection of their own preoccupations. Civil War historians find evidence of wartime crimes and divided loyalties. Those interested in economic history see signs of financial wrongdoing. Romantics detect hints of a love triangle. But the true story remains elusive, hidden behind the silence that descended on that October evening in 1871. This observation is astute. The Blackwood case has become a kind of Rorschach test, with each investigator bringing their own biases and interests to their interpretation of the limited evidence. Yet this multiplicity of possible explanations only adds to the mystery's enduring fascination. What we can say with some confidence is that the tension between Thomas and James Blackwood had been building for months before it culminated at that silent dinner. Whatever revelation occurred at the table was not a sudden betrayal, but the final act in a slow-developing drama of conscience and concealment. The atmosphere in the Blackwood house in the days leading up to that fateful dinner has been described in several accounts. Margaret's diary entries become increasingly fraught with anxiety as October progresses. On October 21st, just 2 days before the dinner, she writes, "Thomas woke shouting in the night again. When I went to him, he was sitting upright in bed, his eyes open but unseeing. He knows, he said over and over. James knows. When I asked what James knows, he seemed to come back to himself and would say no more, only held me with a desperation I have never felt from him before." The next day, October 22nd, the day James wrote his final journal entry and the partially burned letter, Margaret describes a strange calm descending over the house. Thomas spent the day in his study with the door locked, she wrote. I could hear him moving about, opening and closing drawers. When he emerged for supper, there was a resolve in his manner that frightened me more than his previous agitation. He announced that he had invited James to dine with us tomorrow evening, though they have not broken bread together in nearly a month. When I expressed surprise, he said only, "Some things must be faced directly, Margaret. Some reckonings cannot be avoided." The weather on October 23rd, the day of the dinner, matched the ominous mood that had settled over the Blackwood home. Several neighbors recorded in their journals or letters that a strange fog had risen from the White River that morning, shrouding the valley in a ghostly haze that persisted throughout the day. By afternoon, the air had taken on a peculiar stillness, as if the very elements were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. Inside the house, Margaret busied herself with preparations for the dinner, perhaps hoping that the familiar rituals of cooking and setting the table would provide some normality in a situation that had become increasingly surreal. Her diary entry from that morning betrays her growing fear. I found Thomas standing in the dining room before dawn, staring at the empty places at the table. When I asked if he had slept at all, he did not seem to hear me. There is a distance in his eyes now, as if he is already gone from this place, from me. As the hour of the dinner approached, tension gathered in the house like an electrical charge before a storm. Margaret described dressing with particular care that evening, choosing her best gown, a gesture of formality that seems poignant in retrospect, given what was to come. Thomas, too, dressed formally, though Margaret noted that his hands shook so badly that he needed her help with his cravat. James arrived precisely at 5 o'clock, punctual as always. Margaret's description of his appearance is telling. He wore his Sunday suit and had trimmed his beard. He looked not like a man coming to a simple family dinner, but like one attending a funeral or a court hearing. There was a solemnity to his bearing that chilled me. He greeted me warmly enough, but when his eyes met Thomas's, there passed between them a look of such complex emotion, anger, sorrow, resignation, that I felt as if I had intruded upon something intensely private. The meal began with forced pleasantries. Margaret recorded fragments of the conversation, discussions of the weather, the condition of the roads, news from the general store. But beneath this veneer of civility, a current of tension was building. Thomas barely touched his food, instead drinking heavily from the bourbon James had brought. James ate methodically, his eyes rarely leaving his brother's face. The dining room itself seems to have become a character in this unfolding drama. Margaret described the play of candlelight, across the polished surface of the table, the shadows gathering in the corners of the room as the evening progressed, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft clink of silverware against china and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was as the main course was being cleared away that the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Margaret wrote that James suddenly placed his fork down with deliberate care and reached into his coat pocket. "I have something to show you, brother," he said, producing a folded document that he placed on the table between them. What happened next has been the subject of endless speculation. Margaret's diary describes Thomas opening the document, his face draining of color as he read. When he looked up at James, there was something in his expression that made Margaret's blood run cold. "I know what you've done," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. James did not deny whatever accusation was implicit in Thomas's words. Instead, according to Margaret, he smiled, a smile devoid of warmth or humor. "And now you know why it had to be this way," he replied. And then came the silence, that unnatural, weighted silence that would define the Blackwood mystery for generations to come. Margaret described it as unlike any I have known, writing that it seemed as if all the air had been drawn from the room. Thomas and James stared at each other across the table, locked in some terrible understanding that excluded Margaret entirely. "I realized in that moment," she continued, "that I was in the presence of something terrible, not a quarrel between brothers, but a revelation of some truth so dark that it could never be spoken aloud." The remainder of that evening passed in that same oppressive silence. Neither brother spoke another word. Eventually, James stood, nodded formally to Margaret, and left. Thomas remained at the table long after the candles had burned low, staring at nothing, a half-empty glass of whiskey clutched in his hand. Margaret's final entry for that night reads simply, "I fear what tomorrow may bring. There is a stillness in Thomas that frightens me more than any rage." Her fears proved well-founded. When she woke the next morning, Thomas was gone. He had left before dawn, taking only his horse, his rifle, and a small traveling bag. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty space where a husband had been. And across the property, in his own cabin, James Blackwood sat, dead at his desk, a pen still in his hand, his heart stilled by what the official report would later describe as a sudden seizure brought on by extreme agitation. The silence that had fallen over the dinner table had claimed its first victim. In the years that followed, that silence would spread outward from the Blackwood home, touching all who came into contact with the mystery. It would swallow Margaret's questions as she waited in vain for Thomas's return. It would stifle the community's speculations about what had transpired between the brothers. It would follow Thomas westward as he fled from a truth he could not face. And even now, more than 150 years later, that silence lingers in the gaps in historical records, in the unanswered questions that haunt researchers, in the midnight stillness of what was once the Blackwood dining room, where guests sometimes report hearing the phantom clink of silverware against china and feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill. The true nature of what happened between the Blackwood brothers on that autumn evening in 1871 will likely never be known with certainty. Whatever document James presented to Thomas at the dinner table has never been found. Whatever truth was revealed in that moment of terrible silence remains hidden beneath the accumulated dust of history. But the silence itself, that unnatural, weighted silence that descended upon the Blackwood home, continues to echo through the years, a testament to the power of unspoken truths and the secrets that bind us to our past. The house still stands in Mountain View, renovated yet recognizable, a silent witness to events long past but not forgotten. Visitors who spend the night report strange dreams and unexplained sounds. Some claim to feel a sudden chill when passing through the dining room, as if briefly stepping into that moment from 1871, when two brothers stared at each other across a table, one with accusation in his eyes, the other with a terrible truth finally exposed. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, guests report hearing the faint sound of silverware against china, followed by a silence so profound it seems to swallow all other sounds. A silence that spreads from the dining room throughout the house like a physical presence, pressing against the ears and slowing the heart. It is in these moments, perhaps, that we come closest to understanding what happened at the Blackwood table that October evening. Not through facts or theories or historical evidence, but through the experience of that unnatural silence itself, a silence that seems to contain all the weight of betrayal, all the shock of terrible revelation, all the grief of bonds irreparably broken. In the end, this may be the only truth we can know with certainty about the Blackwood mystery, that some silences, once they fall, never truly lift. They echo through time, haunting all who encounter them, reminding us of the power of unspoken truths and the secrets that bind us to our past. And somewhere in that enduring silence, the spirits of Thomas and James Blackwood remain, two brothers locked forever in that moment of revelation, that instant when truth destroyed the bonds of blood, and a silence descended that would never truly end.